Few aspects are as emblematic of Grand Theft Auto as its setting. While each of the open-world series metropolises explore different time periods and motifs, almost all of them take place in an exaggerated yet earnest rendition of the United States, a Hollywood-esque interpretation of the land of the free, where breakneck car chases and high-rolling debauchery permeate every city block. However, while a great deal of the research and development that goes into creating its vision of America currently takes place within the country's borders, this vision first took root well outside of them at a development studio in Dundee, Scotland named DMA Design. Founded in 1987 by David Jones, an enterprising young coder who aspired to make the slickest games his skills could muster, DMA got its start developing side-scrolling shooters and ports of Reflection Interactive's Shadow of the Beast, before coming into its own with the release of Lemmings in 1991. A puzzle-based platformer in which the player guides groups of human-like critters through a host of obstacle-laden levels, Lemmings proved a gigantic hit, selling over 15 million copies and establishing DMA as a developer worthy of recognition almost overnight. The studio would go on to port their breakout title to seemingly every platform under the sun in the decade that would follow, as well as release a litany of sequels to it. Yet it would also continue to develop its share of original concepts, including Uniracers, a stunt-based racing game starring riderless unicycles, and a science fiction-themed role-playing game titled Hired Guns. All of these post-Lemmings projects presented their share of challenges throughout their creation, yet in the end, none proved as difficult to develop as Race and Chase. Originally conceived by DMA's chief creatives as a virtual version of Cops and Robbers, Race and Chase became better known for being a virtual checklist of problems throughout much of its development. Its engine crashed constantly, its cars handled poorly, and perhaps most significantly, it simply wasn't fun. Where previous car-based action games like APB brimmed with speed and a puerile sense of excitement, DMA's felt slow and bland. Its maps, which took players through the municipalities of Liberty City, Vice City, and San Andreas, stand-ins for New York, Miami, and San Francisco respectively, were all impressively detailed, with both people and cars alike moseying through their streets in a highly lifelike manner. But this level of detail amounted to it feeling more like a driving simulator than a high-octane action game. It was around this time that Jones and the rest of DMA Design became acquainted with Sam and Dan Hauser. London-born rebels with a passion for Def Jam recordings and the lifestyle its music typified, the Hausers had both managed in their 20s to score themselves jobs at BMG, helping oversee the development and publication of various video games within the company's nascent technologies division, BMG Interactive. Both believed that the medium represented an exciting and overlooked part of pop culture, and were more than happy to be able to play a part in its proliferation. But it wasn't until DMA approached them with a demo of Race and Chase that they found a project to truly champion. While they were as disenchanted with its problems as its own creators, they both sensed that underneath its ugly exterior, DMA's driving title held considerable potential, and agreed to help see it to release. For months afterward, DMA and the Hausers struggled to try and turn Race and Chase into a game that all would be proud of, exchanging new builds and feedback on how to improve it on a frequent basis, yet failing all the while to figure out how to make it fun. Many within both parties began to fear that if things didn't turn around soon, their game would face the chopping block. Until one day, its design took a turn none had planned for. In a 2011 interview with Gama Sutra, Gary Penn, who at the time was serving as DMA's creative director, revealed that an unexpected programming error suddenly resulted in all of the game's police cars becoming increasingly aggressive, with them attempting to ram into the player instead of pulling them over. Everyone almost immediately fell in love with the chaos it resulted in, and quickly came to realize that it would be much more fun if they made its environments encourage this naturally. Restrictions were removed, objectives were twisted, and within a relatively short period of time, Race and Chase was transformed into a radically different experience, one in which running over pedestrians or hijacking their cars was valued over abiding by the rules of the road. What had previously been a game of cops and robbers was now a game of robbers and cops, a game that everyone agreed deserved a name that better reflected this change: Grand Theft Auto.
First off, Vice City Stories 1984. The whole story starts with a man named Victor Vance, nicknamed Vic. Like plenty of GTA protagonists, Vic falls into the criminal lifestyle by accident. A former US Army soldier, Vance is dishonorably discharged after a stash of drugs and a prostitute are found in his room in the Army barracks. However, neither were there for him. They were intended for his sergeant, Jerry Martinez, who was involved in drug trafficking. When he gets back to civilian life, Vic works for arms dealer Phil Cassidy, a recurring character in later games. Even though he's forced into a life of crime, Vic's moral compass remains intact. Cassidy's brother-in-law, Marty Williams, abuses his wife Mary Beth and their daughter, and eventually kidnaps her. Vic doesn't stand for that, so he kills Marty, starts a relationship with Louise, and takes over Marty's criminal empire. Not long after Vic kills Marty, Vic's brother Lance comes to Vice City to help him get the money for their brother Pete's asthma medicine. Together, they fully take over the criminal elements across the city. Vic and Lance steal Marty Williams' cocaine stash, but things get tense when Vic learns that Lance and Louise used the drugs themselves. Even worse, Vic soon learns that his old sergeant, Jerry Martinez, had only been transporting the drugs that Vic had been discharged for, forcing Vic and Lance to work for the true supplier, the Mendez brothers. In classic GTA fashion, the Mendez brothers soon betray Vic and Lance and kidnap Louise. He and Lance hurry to rescue her, but Lance is captured by Armando Mendez, leaving Vic to fight his way down to the basement of the Mendez mansion on his own. Vic is able to kill Armando and rescue Lance, but he is too late to save Louise. With help from Phil Cassidy and Ricardo Diaz, Vic steals a helicopter and mows down some of Diego Mendez's goons, making his way to the roof of the Mendez building. Vic successfully takes down Diego Mendez and Jerry Martinez, despite Lance arriving just too late to help his brother out. The two Vance siblings readily agree to never go anywhere near drugs again and leave Vice City to send Pete the money for his medication. But even though they fly off into the metaphorical sunset, the story of the Vance brothers isn't over just yet. San Andreas and the Johnson family, 1987. A year later, the story of GTA shifts to the state of San Andreas. In 1987, the Johnson family is living in the city of Los Santos. There's the mother, Beverly, and her children, Sweet, Carl, Kendall, and Brian. The Johnsons suffer a terrible loss when Brian dies, and it's implied that his older brother Carl, nicknamed CJ, was there when he died and didn't really attempt to help him, so Sweet blames CJ for Brian's death. Because of this, CJ leaves Los Santos to escape its corrupting influence and moves to Liberty City, where he begins stealing cars for Joey Leone. Back in Los Santos, the situation on the streets isn't getting any better. The Grove Street families, which Sweet was a part of, begin losing power to the Ballas and Los Santos Vagos gangs because of the city's profitable drug trade. To keep some semblance of power, Grove Street splits into three factions: the original families ruling in Ganton, the Sevilla Boulevard families in Playa del Sevilla, and the Temple Drive families in Temple and Santa Maria Beach. Los Santos, San Andreas, 1991 to 1992. By 1992, the fractured criminal elements in Los Santos hasn't improved at all. The Ballas plan to assassinate Sweet Johnson, the last unifying figure of the Grove Street families. They try to kill him with a drive-by shooting at the Johnson home, but instead of killing Sweet, the Ballas kill his mother, Beverly. Sweet calls CJ to tell him about the tragedy, and CJ agrees to come back to Los Santos for his mother's funeral. CJ returns to Los Santos, but on his way to the family home, he's arrested by police officers Frank Tenpenny, Jimmy Hernandez, and Eddie Pulaski, members of the corrupt Crash Unit. The three of them plan on framing CJ for the murder of Officer Ralph Pendelberg, and they warn CJ that they'd be watching him. Finally, they throw him out of the car. CJ then returns to the Johnson home and meets one of the leading members of the gang, Big Smoke, and the two of them drive together to Beverly Johnson's funeral. Sweet isn't happy to see CJ, but then the Ballas attempt another drive-by shooting at the funeral, destroying Smoke's car. The family and the Grove Street members all survive, but CJ sees that the state of the gang is dire. He decides to stay in Los Santos to help the families get back on their feet. First, CJ begins working with Sweet and other gang members to strengthen the Grove Street family's influence. He meets Kendall's boyfriend, Cesar Villalpando, the leader of the Barrios Los Aztecas gang. He and CJ become good friends, buddies, allies, BFFs if I may say so. And as if things weren't complicated enough, Officer Tenpenny visits CJ, keeping an eye on him as he had promised. Tenpenny orders CJ to kill some Vargos gangsters, burn down a house, and interrupt a meeting between some Russian criminals and Ballas representatives. CJ helps the gang regain control of Ganton and in turn regains more of Sweet's trust. The two of them successfully take over Glen Park from the Ballas and assassinate all of the Ballas OG as revenge for their mother's murder. From there, CJ continues his crusade to take over more territory from the families. At one point, he tries to help reunite the three separate factions, but he, Sweet, Smoke, and fellow member Ryder are ambushed by the cops, only escaping after a lengthy chase. While Sweet is planning a gang war against the Ballas under the Mulholland intersection, Caesar calls CJ, asking to meet up with him immediately for something important. Caesar and CJ meet in Verdun Bluff and watch Ryder, Big Smoke, the Crash officers, and some Ballas leave the garage with a green Saber in it, the same car used in Beverly's drive-by shooting. Shocked, CJ realizes they've been betrayed and Sweet was walking into a trap. He rushes to the Mulholland intersection to save him, and when he gets there, Sweet is heavily injured but luckily still alive. CJ refuses to leave his brother's side and kills all the remaining Ballas at the scene. Just after that, the police arrive and arrest them, taking Sweet to a prison hospital, but CJ doesn't go to jail. Instead, the Crash officers take CJ to the rural city of Angel Pine in Whetstone County. Liberty City Stories, 1998. 6 years later, the story shifts to Liberty City in a different type of organized crime. Tony Cipriani is a wise guy in the Leone crime family, headed by Salvatore Leone. Yes, that's the same man CJ worked briefly for and then betrayed in San Andreas. Tony is forced into hiding after killing a made man, but returns to the life when Salvatore introduces him to the family's capo, Vincenzo Chili. Vincenzo tells Tony that a former Leone member named JD is currently working for the Sindaco family and wants to rejoin the Leones, so he's perfect to use as an inside man. He asks Tony to pick up his car, but the whole plan is actually an ambush. Tony escapes the police and cuts ties with Vincenzo. From there, Tony takes up multiple lines of work. He begins working for JD to further disrupt the Sindaco's operations and also works for his mother to prove himself to her. But Ma isn't impressed. Instead of welcoming Tony, she calls a hit on him, but he manages to escape. Tony does work for Salvatore Leone, but Leone's wife Maria blackmails Tony to get him to work for her while he continues to work for JD. JD explains that the Sicilian Mafia are trying to arrange a peace between the numerous families of Liberty City. Salvatore is convinced there's a rat in the gang, so he has Tony follow the Sicilian boss, Massimo Torini. While doing so, Tony overhears a conversation between the boss and the Diablo's gang, and then another conversation between him and the Triad gang. But then the Triad spot Tony, and he's forced to flee. Overall, everything seems to be going okay for Tony. But then, the tables completely flip. At the supposed ceremony to make JD into a made man, Hamfists, a Leone family bodyguard, kills JD. He explains to a stunned Tony that Salvatore couldn't trust JD, seeing as he would most likely run away from the gang at some point. Tony then drives Hamfist back home and dumps JD's body. Vincenzo calls Tony, asking him to meet him at a freighter, but of course it ends up being a trap, resulting in Tony killing him and his men. Salvatore Leone explains to Tony that the Liberty City mayor, Roger C. Hull, would blame Salvatore for everything that has been going on. So, naturally, Tony assassinates the mayor and brings Salvatore his cell phone. With that, Tony finally becomes a made man with the Leone family, and as a result, Tony's mother finally cancels her hit on him. Meanwhile, it comes to light that the Forellis, yes, these same Forellis that Tommy Vercetti worked for, had Mayor Hull in their pocket the whole time. The Leone family wanted their own candidate, Donald Love, to win the upcoming election. Tony and Salvatore kidnap Mayor Hull's former assistant, who reveals that the Sicilian Mafia controlled the entire Forelli family and wanted war between the families so they could sweep up the enemies. With this new info, the two of them work to weaken the Forelli family. Donald Love's connection to Tony results in him losing the election, and then Salvatore is arrested by new mayor Miles O'Donovan. Tony wants revenge, and Salvatore tells him that the leader of the Sindaco family, Polly Sindaco, helped the Forellis and the Sicilian mob put him in prison. So Polly, of course, becomes Tony's next victim. Donald Love meets Tony at his flop house and tells him his plan to get his wealth back. To start, he needs to steal the plans for Ford Stoughton from his former mentor, Avery Carrington. After Tony kills Avery and gets the plan, he goes on all sorts of criminal adventures. Eventually, Salvatore tells him that he's going to be bailed out of jail. Even though the Sicilians want to keep him in prison, Salvatore's convoy makes it safely to the courthouse. With his situation looking pretty dire, the Sicilian boss Massimo Torini decides to kidnap Miles O'Donovan to stop Salvatore's charges being dropped. Tony and Salvatore chase Torini to Portland Rock, where Tony manages to kill him, ending the driving conflict threatening the Leone family. But of course, Massimo was only the underboss. Instead, his elderly uncle Leone is the real boss of the Sicilian mob. Tony and Salvatore hold a meeting with him at a small restaurant, and Uncle Leone admits defeat, agreeing to return to Sicily peacefully.